The next social class is the upper middle class, and this is the one that is the most shaped by education. They can make up to 125,000 on up, and the reason that people push education so much is because they're trying to get into the upper middle class. And generally, the better the education, the more prestigious job you can get. However, you can go into debt depending on where you're going to school. Here we see some graduates, and they're telling you how much they owe. This student owes 47,000, 31,000, 26, 74,000, 52. So, out of all of the social classes that we're going to be talking about today, this is the one that is the most shaped by education, and education is really important to get to this social class. Now, the next social class we'll look at is the lower middle class, and these are people that are supervised by the upper middle class. They will move up the class ladder. They will eventually start in the lower middle class and then move up and get a raise and so on and so forth. These are people who have a college degree generally, and a good example of this would be people who work at colleges. They start off working entry-level position in college, and then they can slowly move up the social class ladder, and they will eventually become upper middle class. 60,000 on up. Now, this is a national average. In the Valley, it probably wouldn't be 60,000. It would probably be a little bit lower to 40. Then we have the working class, high school diploma. Little hope of moving up, not too much. We're talking about waitresses, people that drive buses. Here's an old job from a long time ago. She actually would wake people up. She would have a straw, and she would shoot like little rocks or frozen peas and wake up people in she would spit a projectile, and it would hit people on the glass and wake them up. So the working class faces a dilemma. They will be employed, have steady employment, but the odds of moving up the social class ladder are rather minimal. Next on the social class, who do we have? We have the working poor. Low-paying, unskilled, seasonal work. They do work on a semi-regular basis. However, they're living check to check, and they're going to remain poor unless, their children get an education and will escape the cycle of poverty. So, generally speaking, these are day laborers, and their job generally isn't permanent. It'll change depending on the time of year. Here's an old job. These are people that would clean the chimney sweeps in England. And again, this is an example of the working poor. And they actually, because of their job, they would develop soot warts, and they were actually tumors. Finally, we have the underclass. They have a little or no connection to jobs. In California, they have a rampant population that is homeless, and there are lots of tents, and there's even many tent cities, and they have little or no connection to jobs. Now, these are people from Nigeria, and these are actually part of the underclass. They sell traditional medicines. However, they also, gather crowds and entertain crowds. And here you see that they have actually domesticated hyenas. And there is a book about their life, and they are generally very poor, but they do sell medicine and they entertain crowds. What are the big three predictors of poverty? That's a good question. Let's look at the answer. The big three predictors of poverty: race, ethnicity. That's the first one. 34 million are poor. Now, don't confuse percentage versus numbers. We're going to break down percentage versus numbers. 26% of Native Americans are poor. That's a high percentage. 24% of African Americans are poor. 10% of Latinos are poor. And only 10% of white Americans are poor. Now, 10% is a very small percentage compared to Native Americans at 26%. So under this, you would think, oh, well, white Americans have the lowest percentage. But the numbers are deceiving. For example, there's only around 2 million Native Americans. African Americans, there are about 35 million. Latino, 40 million. It's probably a little bit more now. But white Americans, 200 million white Americans. So don't be deceived. Even though this percentage is very, very low, it's of a very high number. So therefore, 20 million Americans are poor that are white Americans. So don't confuse percentage with the numbers. White Americans make the largest population of poor people, simply because there's so many of them. Another predictor of poverty is education. Why should you get an education? Because really only 2% of all college graduates are poor. If you get a college education, the odds are you can probably secure a job that will help you. Finally, what is the third and final predictor of poverty? The head of the household. If there isn't a male husband and the women are leading the household, this is called the feminization of poverty. If there's only one person as the head of the household, that means that the financial strains are going to be increasingly difficult. And the head of the household, if it's only a female all by herself, we call this the feminization of poverty. Now, why is there so much feminization of poverty? There are three factors for the feminization of poverty. Some of you might be able to relate to some of these. There are high divorce rates. There are much more divorced people today than, say, 20 years ago or even 40 years ago. So because there is so much divorce, that there is going to be a female head of household. There is a decline in marriage rates for teen mothers. Years ago, a teen mother, the odds are she was probably going to get married. Today, that's not necessarily the case. And the third and final reason for the feminization of poverty is a lack of child support provided by men. They simply abandon the family, leave, and now all the financial burden is on the female head of households. So these are the three factors for the feminization of poverty. Here we see a ladder representing climbing the social class ladder. There are three types of social mobility, and let's look at those three types of social mobility. The first one is intergenerational social mobility, moving up or down the social class from one generation to the next. Hopefully, within a family, the next generation does better than the previous one. That isn't always the case, though. And this is where education plays a big part, because generally the parents want their children to move up the social class ladder, and so they push for education. Now, there is no movement in the least industrialized countries. Why are so many people trying to move to the United States? Well, because the odds are if you work hard, you're going to climb the social class ladder. So the reason there is so much demand for immigration is because opportunities exist here in the United States. Let me show you a little bit of money from around the world. Here is obviously from Australia. This is from New Zealand. This is a flightless bird called the kiwi, and which is indigenous to New Zealand. And here is $1 from the island of Fiji. This is from England. England has a very strong dollar. Each country, the worth of the dollar varies. All right. Now, another type of social mobility is called intra-generational social mobility, and this is changes in social mobility within a person's adult life. So within your own life or within an individual's adult life, are they at the same status from when they were a teenager to when they were 40, or did it change? Hopefully, if everything went well and things went according to how they were planning, they will have a strong or a different social standing from when they were a teen to when they're an adult. Movement is possible in the most industrialized countries, which is once again why people try and move to countries like Australia, United States. Now, does more money equal more happiness? The answer is yes and no. More money does equal more happiness, but then it eventually stops. For example, is someone making $20,000 a year and someone making $60,000 a year, the person making $60,000 is going to be happier than the person making $20,000. Now, if a person making, let's take a high dollar amount. Let's say a person making $100,000 a year. Now, if a person is making $100,000 a year, and then we compare them to a person making $500,000 a year, is there going to be a big, drastic change in the amount of happiness? The answer is no. A person that's making $100,000 a year can already get everything that they need in life. So the difference in life between $100,000 and $500,000, the different levels of happiness is not going to be that dramatic. Now, of course, the person with the $500,000 budget, they're going to have a bigger home and more cars, but the level of happiness does not actually change. Now, here's the dream car for many people, an Aston Martin. This is worth $1 million. It is a beautiful car, but keep in mind, more money does not equal more happiness. It does to a certain point, and then eventually it levels off. And that dollar amount, by the way, is around $60,000 or so. Once you have that type of income, you pretty much can achieve and get everything that you need in life. Now, the third thing that would affect mobility is structural mobility, and these are changes that cause many people to move up or down the social class ladder. And we're talking about things that are outside of your control, like the Great Depression. This is the biggest influence on our social movement. This caused the Great Depression, many people to move down the social class ladder. Now, President FDR, he tried to get people out of the Great Depression with the New Deal. That did help, but ultimately what helped the most was World War II, and that helped a lot of people get out of poverty. So, structural mobility, changes that cause many people to move up or down the social class ladder.